Hello everybody, this is Dr. Willow Ariella. I am making this video so we can examine Chapter 2. Sorry for the bad lighting. It's not the greatest, but I'm making this at night. And anyway, so wanted to talk about some of the things that are discussed in Chapter 2 on developing a good research idea and conducting an ethical project. Some important and interesting information in here. The authors first discuss the starting point for research, which is your research idea and kind of like what are the parts of a research idea. And certainly one of those is that you need to figure out what the gap in the knowledge base is, or what an unanswered question is that is interesting to you. From my experience, sometimes that can be the hardest part to figure out, is a gap in the current knowledge base that you really want to explore, or an unanswered research question. It probably took me, just as an example, about a year to figure out what I wanted to narrow down my research question to for my dissertation project. But anyway, that's generally how people, or where people get their research questions from. And they talk about the characteristics of good research ideas. And one of them they say is that it must be testable, although I would debate that in all qualitative research that there does not have to be a testable research question. And so it's kind of surprising to me that they say that that's the most important characteristic. As you'll learn more about qualitative research in upcoming chapter and discussion, sometimes qualitative research does not have a research question that is testable, because sometimes in qualitative research you're just looking for information and data, and you're not trying to test a question. Anyway, we'll go over that a little bit more in qualitative research. But that they also make a good point about how sometimes people come up with ideas, but they don't really have a good way to test the idea until technology changes, or until our ideas or understanding changes. And that's a really good point, that sometimes we may want to test something, but our methods aren't very good, and so our results won't be very good or very clear. And then later on, because we develop new technology or methods, then we're able to develop better ways to test hypotheses and come up with better data. And that's one of the reasons why things change, why our answers to things may change over time, is because sometimes we think it's something because of how we collect data, or because of the kind of experiments that we do, and then technology changes. So that's one of the reasons, and that's a good thing, so as we continue to learn and grow as humans. That's one cool thing about science. And also they make a point about sometimes our view of nature is not very clear, and so sometimes our research does not work very well, and that's also accurate. Sometimes people get stuck in a perspective, and they find it difficult to look beyond that perspective, and so sometimes it's hard for us to break out of our own belief systems or patterns, and that can limit our research and our findings. Examining past research is your best bet, and this is one reason why the literature review is so important. And so when you're trying to figure out what your research question is, doing the literature review helps you look at past research, and it helps people usually formulate their research question as well as their methodologies and other aspects of their experiment. But it's also the best resource most of the time for research ideas. Um, so it's a really important aspect of research, the literature review. Sources of research ideas, they discuss non-systematic and systematic. Their story about Skinner and his malfunctioning Skinner box was pretty funny. And yes, of course, sometimes malfunctions can lead to new research questions. Um, some of you may have read that Pavlov was not studying the reflexes and salivation responses in dogs in psychology. He was studying something else and happened to notice dogs' reaction to the food substances that they were given, and went off in a different direction. And that happens pretty regularly in research too. So anyway, different stimuli occur, and we can figure out things about our research from different stimuli, systematic and non-systematic research sources. And as they say, past research is probably the most important and biggest part of information used for research questions. And they note that you may find contradictory reports in the literature, and this is very true. And there are a variety of reasons for that, and it's not a bad thing. Some people kind of see it as a negative thing, but one of the things that happens in research is that different people are looking at some aspects of a similar question, or even the same question with replication, and they come up with different results, and that's not a bad thing. That is one of the ways where we figure out whether or not how we're looking at a problem and how we're examining the problem, and different aspects that we're coming up with things. That's how we figure out if what we're doing is good or valid or reliable, those sorts of things. And so contradictions are not a bad thing. They stimulate and inform research. So they're important. They're important to notice. And sometimes out of those contradictions come important studies. And then they mentioned too that one type of past research is the failure to replicate previous findings. And so again, out of contradictions in research, and if someone replicates a research study and they do not get the same kind of information or results, that can be an area for a researcher to investigate. What happened? Why did the results come out differently? They talk about theory and how important theory is, and they mention that theory does guide research, and that is very accurate. And when you do your own research projects, you'll get more of a sense of how important theory is and how it impacts research. Developing a research question. The comic strip at the bottom of page 19 reminds me of the movie I, Robot. The character that is played by the tall actor, I can't think of his name right now, but Dr. Lanning, I think it is. He says, "Ask the right questions," and that is the right question, detective. Anyway, that's what asking the right question is a key ingredient in a good research project. And no coincidence that this book is called The Psychologist as Detective, because they are very similar in a lot of ways, doing detective work and being a researcher. Anyway, so the first goal should be determined accurate. You need to be able to figure out what you're going to explore in your research. And it's not that difficult to turn it into a research question, and we'll see why that is. And so again, they go into surveying the psychological literature and how important that is. But they share their suggestions about steps and how they would recommend you go about conducting a literature review. They mentioned that there's a vast amount of literature, and that is very, very accurate. The number of research articles that are published are just astronomical. And so it helps to have a systematic approach to your literature review. And unfortunately, there's no way around it, but it just takes time. It took me a lot of time to figure out how to learn to search databases really well. It took me a lot of time to figure out what sources were good and helpful and thorough, and what sources weren't. And so it really takes a lot of time and a lot of reading, and there's really no way around that. And if you have if you feel like this is a daunting task, their table 2-1 can be a really good place to start and experiment. I don't use their steps. I have my own process, but I learned it through trial and error. And if you aren't sure, how to get started, or if you are overwhelmed or feel kind of, freaked out about the idea of doing a literature search, then following their steps would be a really good way to start and to develop your own process, refine theirs to make it your own. They mention the internet, and they make a point that I want to reinforce, in that you must be very cautious when you're doing internet searches. I know most of us are really into Google University or Yahoo University or whatever, and the internet can be a really good, the general internet, not the library internet, but the internet can be a really good starting point for generating ideas, but it's generally not a good resource for peer-reviewed or information and reports that have been validated by peers, and that's really what's important in most research. So I think you do want to use the general internet searches sparingly. I generally tend to use them for ideas and jumping off points, but I would not recommend spending much time on general internet searches, but rather using library database internet searches. They also mention Google Scholar. I've tried using Google. Well, I've used it, but I don't really like it. I've not found it to be a good use of my time. So you might want to explore it and see what you think about it. But I don't like it for college or university work. And then again, they make the point that you must be very careful when selecting information from the internet to use in your literature review. We want to use in college, university work, we want to use valid sources that have been evaluated by our peers. And most of the stuff that you're going to find on the general internet is not going to be of good quality. So you want to be careful about that. So they have a table about evaluating internet resources that I think is really good. But again, I think your time is going to be better served in using the library at your college or university for the most part. If you want to find good information. They mentioned something that I've never done, writing authors of articles for reprints. Interesting. I've never seen it before. I've never done that. So, it would be fun to do it and see if you get much reply. So that was an interesting idea. And then they discuss integrating the results of a literature search and how formidable that can be. And yes, it can be formidable. So again, they have a procedure that they recommend. And so again, if you are not sure how to figure out what to do with all that information that you get or that you gather from your literature review, this procedure on page 26 can be really helpful. I think if you don't have one, or if you don't find yours to be all that, if it takes a lot of time, or anyway, you could try this one and see, if it works for you. Everyone has their own method and process, and again, I do mine differently than what the authors recommend, but I think it's a really good recommendation. Their process is a good recommendation um, for dealing with all of your sources. And then they have a great summary for some of the major points they covered. The need for ethical principles. Ethics is a major concern and topic in research of all kinds. It's a topic we could discuss a lot. They only devote part of a chapter to it, which is interesting. Anyway, they mentioned their Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code did have a major impact on the APA as well as other fields in research, and they mentioned some kind of shocking studies that were conducted that today a lot of us would question. Although Milgram's study, I think, is kind of borderline about whether or not it's really problematic, but a lot of people had concerns about Milgram studies and similar studies that have been done. So the main thing is that we have to be very, very, very careful about involving people and animals in research. And the main reason is due to the potential risk and harm that can result in people psychologically, emotionally, or otherwise. It's a really, really important topic that we have to consider. They mentioned that a lot of psychological research involves deception, and it's true. It does, mainly because if generally we let participants know what the study's purpose really is, it can affect, and sometimes we may not know how, but it can affect what they actually do think about in the study and affect their results. And so if you participate, say there are a lot of online psychological studies that people can participate in. If you participate in one of those, it is highly unlikely that you will know the true purpose of that particular research study, partially because the researchers don't want you to be influenced by it. So it's a tricky thing. It's people want to get good, accurate, valid data, but it does tend to involve the necessity for deceiving the participants. Not all the time, but a lot of the times in psychological research especially. And then also when you provide a thorough explanation or description of the project, that can influence participants' responses. And so you don't want to, negatively impact your research by telling participants too much, but you also need to tell them enough so that they are as fully informed as they really deserve to be. So they talk about informed consent, that all participants need to sign an informed consent form. And it's really tricky. The informed consent form itself is tricky because you have to consider the level of the reading skills or abilities of the participants that you'll be working with in your research study. So there's a level of reading, the language, the writing style, that sort of thing, using, jargony-ish kinds of words. So it really helps if you have several people look at it who are from different backgrounds so they can give you some feedback. So the informed consent form itself can influence people, and it can open questions about whether or not people were truly informed about it. Many aspects of research can be affected by factors such as the informed consent process, that may be unknown by the researcher. So we have to, inform participants, they need to consent, but that in and of itself can affect their participation. So, people do studies about how informed consent affects people's participation just itself, and there are other aspects of research that people look at. But still, we have to do it. We have to treat people with respect and understand what their risks are. And the tricky thing is that we may think, as researchers, as educated people, we may think that there's very little or no risk to something, to an experiment, to a study. But there can always be some kind of risk to people participating, even in an anonymous survey. If we ask questions that are sort of a personal nature, people can be triggered by that. And so sometimes it may be really hard for us to see, and sometimes it was hard for me to see in my research, how people could be placed at risk or impacted somehow negatively. But we have to think very, very carefully about that and what the potential is, and sometimes it may not be obvious. So there is some level of risk in every research project that some participants may feel, may have some kind of adverse reaction to it, knowingly or unknowingly, by the researchers. And so how do we address that, especially with vulnerable populations? They talk about the debriefing session, and I don't really know how much of it's done. I have read a lot of research and didn't see that many debriefing sessions done, and so perhaps it's becoming somewhat more required, but I'm not really sure. It's an interesting question. And then authors turn to the topic of the ethical use of animals in psychological research. They mention that the Animal Welfare Act was passed to protect research animals. However, what they don't mention is that the Animal Welfare Act actually excludes many animals, such as rats and mice, which are one of the most commonly used. Those two animals are two of the most commonly used animals in research. Other animals are not included, like farm animals. So even though they say there is protection, there are actually animals who are excluded from that protection, which is a large percentage of the animals used in research. There are some things in place to try to protect animals, but in my opinion, not enough. In a lot of people's opinions, not enough. The authors turn to the Institutional Review Board, which is a committee that must review research experiments, all researchers that involve the participation of humans or animals, and they have to be sure, very, very sure, that the researchers have really carefully considered the issue of ethics and consent forms and how participants are going to be treated in research studies. And so anytime you do some kind of project, then it has to be reviewed by the IRB. It's kind of harder for research projects that students do because they are supposed to go through the IRB too, and so that process usually takes a while. It usually can't happen within enough time in a semester, so it's gotten a little trickier for instructors or professors to have students do research projects in a semester because of the IRB requirements. And then they discuss the experimental's responsibilities, which I think we've discussed a lot. The participants' responsibilities. Interesting, I didn't really cover this aspect when I was in my doctoral program. So I thought it was interesting that they mentioned that. On table 2-5, just want to reinforce the number 2, the first bullet. Am I sure that any participant I might have can read and fully understand my informed consent materials? That's a very important question, as I mentioned before. And then another one, if I collect data on sensitive topics, and what's sensitive to you may not be sensitive to me, etc. Do I know what I need to do if someone may be upset by those sensitive topics? If someone is, disturbed by part of my research, do I have arrangements for that person, people? Safely storing data, that is a big one, very big one. We have to be very careful in storing confidential information so that it doesn't happen that someone is guaranteed confidentiality and then their information becomes non-confidential. That really is disturbing to not only people who participate in experiments, but also researchers who may have a harder time than gaining participants' trust. Can I make sure that incentives don't affect the participants? And that was an important question in one of my research studies where I decided not to use incentives for a variety of reasons. And then ethical obligations once your research is completed. So they discuss plagiarism. Can't say enough, unfortunately, about being careful on plagiarism. On number 1 on page 43, they mention any part of your paper that contains the exact words of an author. And the general kind of guideline is if you use 3 or more words in a row, then you must quote them. So that's what I've heard. You can kind of see if that's what other people say. Another one, do not hand in for credit a paper that is the same or similar as one you've handed in elsewhere. That's called recycling. You need to ask for permission about that. And they mentioned that number 2 is the most problematic, and I think that's true. It's most problematic for most people, adapting material, changing a few words, inverting sentence order, that sort of thing. But, the main thing is that if you do use someone else's information, you can do that. You can change the words up. You can reverse the sentence order and that sort of thing as long as you cite it. So you just need to cite things that you use from other people, things that are not your own ideas and they're not widely known. And I mentioned an idea that I think is good to, once you've read through stuff and you start writing, that you put those things away so that you're not tempted to copy or paraphrase without citing, is what they mean. So again, if you copied or paraphrased their last sentence in this textbook, you would be guilty of plagiarism if you didn't cite. So I think they kind of made it a little bit unclear by not mentioning that it's not plagiarism if you cite it. And then they talk a little bit about that. Unfortunately, even professionals who've been doing research for a long time that we think would know better, unfortunately, they plagiarize sometimes. And there are some reasons for that. They, may not seem like good ones, but there are reasons why. And they mention the pressure to publish, and that's very, very true, unfortunately. And they also mentioned the fabrication of data. I've heard about some unfortunate results of that. Lying with statistics. Again, need to be very careful about how you present information. It's difficult though, because I don't really think you can present results in an unbiased manner. But I think you can be biased and state your biases, as far as you know what they are. And then citing references, you want to be sure that you do cite, and they talk about secondary sources because you can't find a copy of the original report. I've had, times where I found a source cited and I could not find the original. So you just need to cite that secondary source as they mention. But the ideal is to find that source so that you can read it for yourself and be sure that it's being used appropriately. Let's see. Yeah, so those are the main things that I wanted to discuss with you and kind of highlight from Chapter 2. And I appreciate your time and attention, and I hope that you will ask questions and explore and see what we can come up with together. Sorry, there's a mosquito in here. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to our discussions. Aloha.